Imagine a battle that didn't begin yesterday or even a century ago, but thousands of years ago. A conflict that transcends time, blending the sacred and the earthly, faith and politics, the past and the future. This isn't just a story about land and borders. It's a story about divine promises, ancestral rivalries, and a struggle that shapes the destiny of the world. Welcome to the Eternal Compass, where today we'll delve into one of the most complex and gripping disputes in human history, the conflict between Israel and Palestine. For many, this clash is seen through two lenses. On one side, politics, a territorial and nationalist struggle between two peoples claiming the same land as their home. But for others, especially Christians, this battle goes far beyond politics. It's spiritual, a cosmic confrontation foretold by biblical prophecies, stretching back to the pages of Scripture and echoing as an unseen war between forces greater than ourselves. But how did it all begin? To answer that, we must return to the origins, to the dawn of organized humanity, and to the moment when God made a promise that would change everything. Abraham, a name that reverberates through Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions as the father of nations. He wasn't just a man, he was the bearer of a divine covenant, chosen by God to be the patriarch of descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. And it is in this covenant that we find the seed of the conflict. God promised Abraham that his descendants would inherit the land of Canaan, a fertile, rich, and strategically located territory that would later be known as the Promised Land. But Abraham had two sons, and this is where the story divided. Ishmael, the firstborn, was born to Hagar, an Egyptian servant. Isaac, on the other hand, was born to Sarah, Abraham's wife, in a divine miracle, as Sarah was old and barren. And here arises the question that would echo through millennia: who was the rightful heir to this promise? According to the Bible, God's covenant would pass through Isaac and his descendants, making him the father of the Israelites. But God also blessed Ishmael, promising that he would become the father of a great nation. And it is through him that many Arabs, including Palestinians, trace their lineage. This initial division wasn't just a family matter, it was the starting point of a rivalry that would intertwine with the very identity of these peoples. But what did this promise mean in practice? For the Jews, the Promised Land isn't just a piece of territory. It is the materialization of an eternal divine covenant, something that transcends time and is inscribed in Scripture as an immutable inheritance. For Palestinians, however, this same land represents their ancestry. They have lived there for centuries, cultivating their roots in a territory they believe is rightfully theirs. This clash of narratives, where both sides claim legitimacy over the same land, formed the foundation of a conflict that transcends geography. We're not just talking about politics, we're talking about identity, faith, and the fight for a legacy that defines who they are and where they belong. In 1948, this tension reached a historic climax. It was the year the State of Israel was officially established, marking a moment of triumph for Jews who, after centuries of exile and persecution, finally had their homeland restored. For them, it was the miraculous fulfillment of prophecy. But for Palestinians, it was the beginning of the Nakba, or catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were expelled from their homes or fled, leaving behind entire villages that were erased from the map. But how did we get here? And why is the creation of a Jewish state in 1948 seen so differently by these two nations? To answer that, we need to explore the events leading up to this decision, from the rise of the Zionist movement in the late 19th century to the international disputes that redrew the borders of the Middle East. And that's what we'll do together on this journey. We'll dive into the layers of this history, unraveling the origins of this conflict and uncovering how divine promises, ancestral rivalries, and historical events intertwine in a narrative that still shapes the present. But beware, this isn't a simple story. It's a story that challenges our understanding of the past, tests our beliefs, and forces us to confront fundamental questions about faith, justice, and identity. So, get ready. This is a journey you won't be able to look away from. You're about to uncover secrets hidden in the pages of history and the prophecies of Scripture. By the end, you might not see the world the same way. This is the Eternal Compass, and this is just the first page of a chapter that will change everything. To truly understand the impact of 1948, we need to dive into its roots, back to a time when the land of Canaan, or Palestine, was much more than just a spot on the map. It was a promised land for some, but an ancestral home for others. At the end of the 19th century, the region was under Ottoman rule and its population was predominantly Arab, consisting of Muslims, Christians, and a small Jewish community. In this context, a movement began to emerge in Europe, shaped by generations of pain and suffering: Zionism. Zionism didn't emerge in a vacuum. It was a response to centuries of persecution, discrimination, and violence faced by Jews across Europe. Pogroms, massacres, and systematic marginalization led many Jews to lose hope of ever assimilating into the societies they lived in. Zionism, led by figures like Theodor Herzl, offered a revolutionary vision: a national homeland for the Jewish people where they could live in safety and freedom. And for Herzl and his followers, there was no question where that homeland should be in the land of Israel, the promised land of their ancestors. But there was a problem. Palestine was already inhabited. For the Arabs living in the region, their lands, villages, and traditions were the foundation of their lives and identities. They viewed the growing Jewish immigration with increasing concern, fearing they would one day be dispossessed of their home. Initially, however, this tension was latent, still contained, as the Jewish population was relatively small. That began to change in the early 20th century. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire during World War I paved the way for foreign powers to shape Palestine's destiny. The 1917 Balfour Declaration was a turning point in this process. In this document, the British government expressed support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. For Jews, it was a moment of hope. For Arabs, it was an act of betrayal, especially since the British had previously promised to support Arab independence in exchange for their help against the Ottomans. From 1920 onward, Palestine was administered by the British under a League of Nations mandate. During this period, Jewish immigration increased significantly, especially in the face of the Holocaust in Europe. Hundreds of thousands of Jews fled to Palestine, seeking refuge in a world that seemed to have abandoned its humanity. But this mass exodus only deepened tensions with local Arabs who feared losing control of their homeland. The 1930s and 1940s were marked by escalating violence, Arab revolts, British crackdowns, and armed clashes between Jewish and Arab communities turned Palestine into a land of constant turmoil. Determined to establish their own state, Jews organized paramilitary forces like the Haganah and Irgun, actively resisting British rule and growing Arab opposition. For many, it was a fight for survival. For others, it was the prelude to an impending tragedy. The breaking point came in 1947 when the United Nations proposed a partition plan for Palestine. This plan divided the territory into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem under international control. For Jews, it was a moment of celebration, though not without reservations, as the proposed Jewish state was small and fragmented. For Arabs, the plan was unacceptable. How could they agree to lose most of their land to a people who, until recently, were a minority in the region? Their rejection was swift. And then, on May 14, 1948, a moment that would forever change the history of the Middle East. David Ben-Gurion, leader of the Jewish community, declared the independence of the State of Israel. The next day, neighboring Arab nations, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, launched a military attack, attempting to crush the new state before it could take root. What followed was a brutal war, known to Israelis as the War of Independence and to Palestinians as the Nakba, or catastrophe. During this war, more than 700,000 Palestinians were forced to leave their homes. Entire villages were destroyed, and families who had lived in the region for 4 generations became refugees, scattered across neighboring countries or confined to overcrowded camps. For Palestinians, the Nakba wasn't just an event. It was an open wound, a collective trauma that continues to define their identity. They lost not only their lands, but also their hope for self-determination. On the other side, for Jews, the creation of Israel was a miracle. After centuries of exile, persecution, and genocide, they finally had a place to call home. For many, it was the fulfillment of a divine prophecy. a sign that God was restoring his chosen people to their promised land. But this celebration came at a price. The conflict that began in 1948 did not end with the signing of armistices in 1949. On the contrary, it planted the seeds of a dispute that would continue to grow, fueled by resentment, distrust, and an endless struggle for justice and sovereignty. And so, we arrive at one of the greatest paradoxes of this story. How can two nations claim legitimacy over the same land? How can a place simultaneously be a divine refuge and an ancestral heritage? And most importantly, how can a conflict so deeply rooted ever find resolution? This is the question guiding our journey. In the next chapter, we'll explore how the events following Israel's creation shape the future of this contested land. The Nakba was just the beginning of a long history of occupations, resistance, and tragedies. As we'll see, the echoes of 1948 continue to resonate today, in the borders, in negotiations, and in the hearts of those who call this land home. The events following 1948 transformed not just the geography of Palestine, but also the soul of its peoples. When the last shot was fired and the armistices were signed, the landscape of the Middle East was forever changed. Israel emerged as a new, sovereign, and determined nation, occupying 78% of historic Palestine. But the cost of this victory was immense, and the scars of the Nakba would be passed down through generations of Palestinians, shaping an identity rooted in the trauma of loss and the relentless quest for justice. For the Palestinians who fled, or were forced to flee, their homes, there was nowhere to return. The villages that once formed the heart of their communities were reduced to ruins or taken over by new Jewish settlers. Many sought refuge in neighboring countries like Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt, where they were confined to refugee camps that quickly became living symbols of their stateless condition. For these refugees, the right of return, the hope of one day going back to the lands from which they were expelled, became a central struggle, a cry of resistance in the face of a world that seemed to have forgotten their pain. For Israel, however, the newly founded state faced monumental challenges. Surrounded by enemies unwilling to recognize its legitimacy, the young nation found itself in a constant battle for survival. What was for Jews the fulfillment of a 2,000-year-old dream was, for Arabs, an open wound, a constant reminder of what they had lost. Israel's military victory in 1948 did not bring peace, but ushered in a new era of tensions, marked by territorial disputes and the struggle for security amid unrelenting hostility. In the years that followed, historic Palestine was divided into three parts. Israel controlled the majority of the territory. Jordan annexed the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, while Egypt took control of the Gaza Strip. This geopolitical division left Palestinians without a state of their own, fragmented and reliant on foreign regimes that often used their cause as a bargaining chip in regional power games. Meanwhile, as Arab leaders waged their political battles, a new movement began to emerge among Palestinians, the fight for self-determination. The idea that only they could fight for their land, their identity, and their future began to gain momentum. Groups like the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, founded in 1964, emerged as the voice of the Palestinian people, vowing to resist occupation and reclaim their homeland at any cost. At the same time, Israel continued to consolidate its hold, building infrastructure, expanding communities, and transforming the desert into fertile land. But its existence was far from secure. The country's borders were marked by constant tension, with sporadic attacks from Arab militant groups and the looming threat of another armed conflict. For many Israelis, each day was a struggle to ensure the state survived another year. Then came 1967, a year that would forever alter the balance of power in the Middle East. The stage was set, rising hostilities between Israel and its Arab neighbors, troops massing at the borders, and an escalation of rhetoric that seemed to signal an inevitable war. It was in this context that Israel launched a preemptive strike, marking the start of the Six-Day War. In just 6 days, Israel redrew the region's map. With brilliant military strategy and the advantage of surprise, the country captured territories that tripled its size. The Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip were taken from Egypt, the Golan Heights from Syria, and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, from Jordan. For Israelis, it was a miraculous victory, a moment of national euphoria. For Palestinians, it was yet another chapter of displacement and despair. The capture of East Jerusalem in particular carried profound significance. For Jews, it was the realization of a millennia-old dream, the return to full control of their spiritual capital. The Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism, was finally in their hands. But for Palestinians and the Arab world, it was a devastating blow. Jerusalem, with its rich history and religious importance, became the symbol of everything that had been lost and of all that remained at stake. What followed the Six-Day War was an occupation that would transform the lives of millions of Palestinians. Under Israeli control, the West Bank and Gaza became territories marked by a new kind of conflict. Checkpoints, Israeli settlements, and severe restrictions created an environment of constant tension and frustration. For Palestinians, living under occupation was a daily reminder of their loss, a signal that their struggle was far from over. On the other hand, Israel faced its own contradictions. How could it maintain security in such vast and populous territories? How could it balance the Jewish identity of the state with control over millions of Palestinians? These questions became a central dilemma, shaping the country's domestic and foreign policy in the decades to come. But one thing was clear: the Six-Day War had changed everything. The lines between survival and expansion, between security and occupation, became increasingly blurred. And as the world watched the Middle East with a mix of fascination and concern, the narrative of Israel and Palestine became further entwined with global issues of justice, human rights, and geopolitics. Yet behind the headlines and political battles, ordinary people continued to live their lives hackpot, grappling with the direct consequences of this unending conflict. Families torn apart, generations growing up in refugee camps, communities living in constant fear. These were the untold stories that defined the true nature of the conflict. And so the narrative moves forward. In an increasingly polarized world, the question remains: how far will these nations go to protect their stories and claim their future? And will they ever find common ground to heal the wounds that have divided them for so long? After the Six-Day War in 1967, the occupation of Palestinian territories marked a new chapter in the already turbulent history between Israel and Palestine. It was a moment that drastically altered the lives of millions, redefining not only physical borders, but also the limits of hope and resistance. For Palestinians, this occupation was not just a territorial issue. It was a daily reminder of a future that seemed increasingly unattainable. For Israelis, it was a strategic victory that ensured their security but brought with it new moral and existential challenges. The occupied areas, West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, quickly became the stage for a complex power dynamic. Israel began constructing settlements in the occupied territories, establishing Jewish communities on historically Palestinian lands. The stated goal was to strengthen Israeli presence in the region, create a buffer against potential threats, and secure sovereignty over sites of historical and religious significance. But for Palestinians, every settlement was a direct attack on their right to the land, an erosion of their identity, and a blow to their future as a nation. These settlements were not merely physical structures, they were declarations of power, signals that Israel's presence was not temporary. For many Palestinians, the occupation was not only military, but also psychological. Checkpoints, armed patrols, restrictions on movement, and the constant expansion of settlements created an atmosphere of surveillance and tension, where each day was a struggle to maintain even a semblance of normalcy. At the same time, Palestinian resistance began to organize more systematically. The Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, led by Yasser Arafat, emerged as the primary voice of the Palestinian people, employing both diplomatic efforts and armed actions to achieve its goals. For the PLO, the struggle was not only about territory, but about the existence of a people whose identity was being systematically erased. However, this struggle faced monumental challenges. Arab support, often championed in fiery rhetoric, rarely translated into concrete action. While Arab leaders used the Palestinian cause as a political rallying cry, the Palestinian people remained marginalized, caught between promises of liberation and the reality of an increasingly oppressive occupation. Furthermore, the growing influence of external actors, such as the United States and the Soviet Union, turned the conflict into a centerpiece on the Cold War geopolitical chessboard. By the early 1980s, the occupation had become even more entrenched as Israel intensified its settlement efforts in the West Bank and Gaza. These settlements, widely considered illegal by the international community, deepened the divisions between the two peoples. For Israelis, they were a way to connect with their biblical history and ensure security in a hostile region. For Palestinians, they were a blatant usurpation of their lands and an insurmountable obstacle to the creation of an independent state. It was in this context that the First Intifada erupted in 1987. The word intifada, meaning uprising or shaking off, encapsulated the frustration and despair of a generation raised under occupation. What began as spontaneous protests quickly evolved into a massive movement of resistance, involving general strikes, boycotts, and direct confrontations with Israeli forces. For Palestinians, the Intifada was a collective cry for freedom, a declaration that they would no longer be mere spectators in their own history. Israel's response was harsh. The military, facing popular demonstrations often characterized by stones against bullets, implemented severe measures to suppress the uprising. Images of Palestinian children confronting Israeli tanks dominated global headlines, sparking international outrage and shedding light on the living conditions in the occupied territories. Yet, despite the brutality, the Intifada achieved something remarkable. It brought the Palestinian issue to the forefront of international discourse, galvanizing support and forcing the world to acknowledge what had long been ignored. For many, the Intifada symbolized the unbreakable spirit of the Palestinian people, but it also exposed weaknesses and divisions within their movement. While some advocated for armed resistance, others believed diplomacy was the path to self-determination. It was during this time that Hamas emerged, an Islamic organization challenging both Israeli authority and the PLO itself. With its fiery rhetoric and militant attacks, Hamas added a new layer of complexity to the conflict, creating internal divisions that persist to this day. Meanwhile, Israel faced its own identity crisis. The occupation was taking a toll not only on Palestinians, but also on Israeli society. Many Israelis began questioning the morality of controlling millions of Palestinians without granting them basic rights. Peace movements and human rights groups gained traction, challenging the government and calling for negotiations. And so battle lines were drawn, not only between Israelis and Palestinians, but also within their own communities. For Palestinians, the struggle was as much against the occupier as against internal divisions. For Israelis, it was a fight to reconcile their identity as a Jewish democracy with the reality of an occupation that contradicted their deepest values. The post-1967 occupation was more than a territorial issue. It was a watershed moment that redefined the conflict's dynamics. It transformed the lives of millions, created new paradigms of resistance, and cast doubt on the future of both peoples. As the occupation deepened the chasm between Israelis and Palestinians, the world watched, torn between hope for a solution and fear that the conflict would never end. Have you ever wondered how such a small land could carry so much history, so many promises, and yet so much pain? After the Six-Day War, it seemed Israel had gained everything: strategic territories, sacred cities, enhanced security. But what followed showed that sometimes a victory can be the beginning of a new kind of battle. Imagine living in a land where every stone carries centuries of meaning. For some, it's proof of a divine promise. For others, it's the soil where their ancestors lived and died. Now, imagine that land suddenly filled with barriers, checkpoints, walls, settlements rising like islands within another culture. This was the reality that took shape in the occupied territories. For Palestinians, it was like living in a dream that was slowly becoming a nightmare. Every time they looked at the horizon, there was something new, a new construction, a new fence, a new boundary. How much longer, they wondered, and maybe you're asking the same question now. How much longer can people live like this, caught between hope and despair? While Palestinians faced this new reality, Israelis were also discovering that controlling land doesn't mean controlling hearts. Every settlement built was a spark, every checkpoint a flame that fueled resistance. Then in 1987, something unexpected happened: the First Intifada. It wasn't a planned uprising led by leaders. It was something born in the streets, among ordinary people, among families tired of waiting. And when it began, no one knew how it would end. What made this uprising different? It wasn't armies clashing on battlefields, but young people throwing stones at tanks, strikes, boycotts, protests that grew day by day. It was as if every action declared to the world, "We are still here. We have not been erased." And the world saw. The images crossed oceans, showing a side of the conflict many preferred to ignore. But as you might imagine, the response was harsh. Israeli troops were sent to contain the protests, arrests, violence, and of course, even more suffering on both sides. For those who were there, it felt like living in an endless cycle of cause and consequence, where every act of resistance brought even greater repression. And amid it all, something shifted. A new force emerged, a new name, Hamas. For many Palestinians, it represented a more direct, aggressive approach. For others, it was a symbol of division, a fracture within their own people. Like them or not, Hamas brought something that couldn't be ignored, a new dynamic, further complicating an already intricate conflict. Meanwhile, Israeli society began to question itself. There were those who believed the solution was to tighten their grip even more, build more walls, control more land. But there were also those who said, this can't go on. There's a price to be paid, and it's not just with weapons or soldiers. It's with who we are as a people. And this internal division grew, mirroring the very fractures of the conflict itself. And here we are at a moment where everything seems to have reached its breaking point. On one side, a people seeking freedom, independence, and a place to call home. On the other, a nation fighting to ensure its survival in a world that often feels stacked against it. It's a clash of forces where neither side wants to give in, yet both lose something with each passing day. But what if I told you that even amidst all this chaos, there have been attempts at peace? That at some point, leaders sat down together and tried to find a way out. The question is, why has it never worked? Why does every glimmer of hope seem to vanish as quickly as it appears? In the next section, we'll dive into exactly that. Get ready, because the story of peace negotiations has its own twists and turns. Now, imagine the scene. Leaders from around the world gathered around gleaming tables, surrounded by flags, with translators murmuring in different languages. They're there with one grand objective: peace. Israel and Palestine finally side by side, trying to find a way to end decades of suffering. It sounds like a dream, doesn't it? But what happens when, instead of progress, every word spoken seems to reopen old wounds? Peace negotiations in the Middle East are like an incomplete puzzle, where every piece has sharp edges that cut. For decades, we've heard of historic meetings, signed agreements, handshakes captured as symbols of hope. And yet, here we are, so many years later, still stuck in the same narrative of conflict. Why is it so difficult? It all began with promises. In the 1990s, it seemed like something was changing. Agreements like the Oslo Accords brought a sense that perhaps, just perhaps, a new chapter was being written. Can you imagine the hope? Palestinians and Israelis for the first time officially recognizing each other's existence. What could possibly go wrong? Well, a lot. The promises of those agreements were ambitious: an independent Palestinian state, guaranteed security for Israel, Jerusalem somehow shared. But when it came time to turn words into actions, it was as if the desert sands swallowed up the goodwill. What seemed like a path to peace became a minefield, where every step forward led to a new obstacle. And you might be asking yourself, why didn't it work? The answer lies in something as human as it is painful: trust, or in this case, the lack of it. On one side, Israel argued that it needed to ensure its security. Every attack, every bomb was a reminder that one mistake could be catastrophic. On the other side, Palestinians watched settlements continue to expand on their lands, even as leaders discussed peace and wondered, how can we trust those who seem to take more than they give? And so, as has happened so many times in this conflict's history, the cycle repeated: crushed hopes, renewed violence, and a growing sense that peace might just be a mirage. But that didn't stop further attempts: summits at Camp David, negotiations in Taba, treaties proposed by American presidents, European leaders, even Arab nations. With each round, the same promise: this time will be different. But it never was, because at its core, some issues remained immovable obstacles. Who controls Jerusalem? How do you address the right of return for Palestinian refugees? What happens to the settlements in the West Bank? And as these questions went unanswered, distrust grew. Both sides saw concessions as weakness. And without concessions, peace was nothing more than a beautiful word on papers that ended up shelved and forgotten. And here's the most curious thing. Ordinary people, the ones living the conflict daily, often had more in common than the leaders themselves. An Israeli mother who lost her child in an attack. A Palestinian father who saw his home demolished. Both yearning for the same thing, for their children to grow up in a world where they wouldn't have to look over their shoulder. Yet the leaders, trapped in their politics and ideologies, kept playing the same game, where no one ever wins. And maybe that's what makes this story so painful. It's not just the land that's contested, but the lives, the dreams, and the generations growing up with fear, anger, and resentment. Each failure to achieve peace feels like a page ripped out of a book that never reaches its conclusion. But the question remains, is there still hope? Did you know that while we talk about territorial disputes, wars, and failed peace negotiations, something deeper is happening behind the scenes of this conflict? It's as if there's an invisible battle, a war of narratives, where each side seeks to shape not only maps, but also memory and global perception. And perhaps this is even more powerful than tanks or treaties. On one side, Israel presents itself as a nation reborn from the ashes, a people who, after millennia of exile and suffering, found the strength to turn deserts into cities, protect their borders, and secure a future for their children. Their narrative is one of resilience, the fulfillment of a divine promise, and survival in a world that often seemed bent on erasing them. On the other side, Palestinians tell a story of ongoing tragedy, of generations born and raised under occupation, of villages erased from maps, of a people who, despite everything, refuse to give up. For them, the struggle is not just for land, but for recognition, dignity, and a future where they can live without the shadow of a foreign army controlling their every move. And in the midst of it all is the rest of the world, watching, choosing sides, trying to understand a conflict that seems so simple. Who does this land belong to? But is, in fact, incredibly complex. The media, governments, and social networks have all become part of this larger battle, where words and images are as powerful as any army. Now think about this. In recent years, something has radically changed. Technology has brought the conflict into our hands, literally. Social media platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok have turned ordinary citizens into reporters, activists, and historians. A video recorded by a teenager on a street in the West Bank can reach millions within hours. A post from Jerusalem can spark protests in New York, London, or Paris. But this has also brought new challenges. With so much information circulating, it's easy to get lost in the noise. Who's right? Who's wrong? It's as if each side is shouting louder, vying for the attention of an audience often tired of hearing about yet another Middle East conflict. And here's something fascinating. While leaders debate and governments play their geopolitical chess games, ordinary people have begun finding their own ways to build bridges. Groups of Israelis and Palestinians who, despite all their differences, have chosen to come together to seek local solutions. Initiatives that foster dialogue among young people, share stories, and attempt to create a new narrative away from the world's gaze. Of course, these stories rarely make headlines. They're small. They don't fit neatly into the larger narrative of the conflict. Yet they exist. Like small rays of light in a dark night, they show that, even amid chaos, there are those who still believe in the possibility of something different. Meanwhile, governments continue to play their game. Israel, with its increasingly rigid security policies, expanding settlements, and tightening control over East Jerusalem. The Palestinians, divided between the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza, struggling to maintain unity amid internal and external challenges. And the world, with its sanctions, resolutions, and mediation attempts, often seems to be merely observing, unable to make a real difference. And so comes the question no one seems willing to answer. What comes next? Because if there's one thing we've learned from this history, it's that every attempt to change the status quo meets fierce resistance. Every time there seems to be a chance for peace, something happens to bring it all back to square one. Yet history doesn't stand still. It keeps moving, sometimes slowly and painfully, but always advancing. Perhaps what intrigues us most about this conflict is that it is both incredibly specific and universal. It's about a land, a people, a history. But it's also about something we all understand: the struggle for belonging, for security, for hope. In the end, maybe that's what keeps the world so fixated on this small stretch of land, because in some way the story of Israel and Palestine reflects our own struggles, our own divisions, our own unrealized dreams. And this is where things get truly interesting, because while some see this conflict as unsolvable, others believe it could be the key to something greater. That if we can find a solution here, perhaps we can learn something that can be applied elsewhere, in other conflicts, in other divisions that continue to separate us as humanity. But this raises an important question. Are we willing to ask the hard questions, to face uncomfortable truths, to acknowledge that for peace to happen, both sides will have to give up something? It's a question with no easy answers, but one that cannot be ignored. We've reached the end of this journey, but what does it truly mean? The conflict between Israel and Palestine isn't just a story of disputed borders or failed peace agreements. It's a reflection of the complexities of humanity, our ability to create divisions as deep as mountains, but also to find connections that transcend any barrier. This story teaches us something powerful. It reminds us that no matter how old a dispute may be, no matter how deeply rooted the resentments, there's still room for choices. Choices to listen, to understand, to reevaluate. Because at its core, what we all want is something incredibly simple: security, dignity, a place to call home. And perhaps, just perhaps, the real battle here isn't between two peoples, but against the very idea that we are destined to live in eternal conflict. As we watch this story unfold, there's a lesson we cannot ignore. No matter where you are in the world, no matter what your beliefs or perspectives may be, there's something universal here: the desire for peace, for reconciliation, for a better future, not just for ourselves, but for the generations to come. This isn't just their fight. It's one that connects us all because it forces us to reflect on who we are as humanity and where we are headed. And so we arrive at the final question. Is there hope? Perhaps the answer isn't found in grand summits or international headlines, but in small acts of courage, in conversations that begin with empathy, in gestures that may seem insignificant but plant the seeds of change. Because in the end, real change rarely comes from the top. It begins at the grassroots, in the hearts of people. Now, as you reflect on everything we've explored here, I want to leave you with an invitation. If this story moved you, sparked your curiosity, your empathy, or even new questions, I encourage you to keep this conversation going. Share your perspective in the comments. What do you think it will take to achieve peace? What has this story taught you? And more than that, don't let this journey end here. Subscribe to the Eternal Compass, because this is where we explore not just the facts, but their meaning, where we unravel ancient stories that still echo today. When you subscribe, you're not just supporting this channel, you're joining a community seeking to understand the world in its entirety, the shadows and the light, the hard questions and the unexpected answers. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapters, because there's still so much more to discover. Are you ready to be part of this ongoing journey? The world is full of stories waiting to be told, and here at the Eternal Compass, they find a home. Thank you for watching, for reflecting, and for being part of this quest for understanding. Until next time, may we continue together unraveling the mysteries that connect the past, present, and future.